I'm starting with more of a general view. First, a little bit of bragging about Novus in English. Most of you probably know about us already. We do about 1,000 research projects a year. We work with all types of organization, politics organization, public sector, private sector, and also scientific research. We have Michael Dahlén, who's part of our board, and we never stop talking, he and I. And I have to brag about the latest election. We were closest, and we weren't the closest because we could predict the future the best, but because nobody changed their mind the last days. Because we're not trying to predict the future. That's a very important thing to remind everyone of all the time. If you change your mind, you change your mind. We're not trying to predict that. General question, is democracy threatened? And we did research on the members of the Swedish Parliament, and actually 40% said that democracy was threatened to a very large or pretty large extent. The question is, why would that be the case? I'm not really sure, because I didn't ask that, but I have some theories. But let's just stay with this thing that the Swedish Parliament actually think that democracy is threatened. And what is the core problem that we face, not only in Sweden, but I'm using Sweden as an example, and then you'll probably fill in with more of a broader view. The thing is that it's been discussions about if it should be a left or right issue, that the left or but it's not about left or right, and it's not about political ideology either. It is actually more about stopping a perceived negative development. Most of the voters now are actually trying to find this emergency break in the society, because it's not looking very good. The future is looking very bleak. And we have a very quickly degrading trust in the society. I see so many examples in the Swedish society today that actually are quite scary. But I won't go into that right now. I'll just try to summarize this, because it's easy to think that people are stupid, but that's not the problem. The problem today is that more and more think almost everyone else is just that. That you actually think that you're surrounded by idiots. Maybe not the ones you know, but the ones on the internet. So I'm that again. And also looking at the future. Today, we asked, do you think today's children in Sweden will grow up to a better or worse society compared to today? Looking at all Swedes, there's 59% of the Swedes that actually think the children will grow up to a worse society than today. But if you also break it down to political parties, looking at the traditional opposition leader, it looks more or less like the Sweden in whole. Looking at the Social Democrats, the government, this is also not good, because it's almost as many thinking that we are going to a worse future, even if you still support the government. And looking at the Swedish Democrats, or the handbrake party, emergency brake party, that I actually want to call them if you're not from Sweden, is 94% think that the children will grow up to a worse society than today. So we have a cluster here in if you think it's going down the drain, you will most likely sympathize with Swedish Democrats. And also this, to what extent do you feel safe with the political leadership in Sweden today? Looking at the entire Swedish population, it's only 4% that are very safe. 37 pretty safe. And also if we look at the differences here, looking at the traditional opposition party, the moderate party, we have a majority that are pretty or very unsafe, but they are a little bit less safe than the total. Looking at the Social Democrats, it's only 12% of the Social Democrats that also feel very safe with the political government. Yeah?
Or exactly what do you mean with safe?
Trygg.
Like trust? Or
Yeah, yeah. Do you trust the? Yeah, exactly. But yeah, but we can have discussions later if but it's open. Yeah, it's open to discussion as well, and that's probably what you think, what you mean. But if but also if we look at the Swedish Democrats, they are very unsafe. And one thing more, it's that the political leadership doesn't have to be the government. That's also probably good to know. It could actually be the political system in whole. But the same thing here. It's the Swedish Democrats are, there's no one who's very safe or pretty safe, basically, with the political leadership in Sweden.
Sorry, another question.
Yeah.
Is it among voters, the people voting?
Yeah, this is the people who sympathize today. The people who sympathize with Swedish Democrats today. This is not the politicians. This is the voters. Yeah. And also, I think this image actually visualizes the challenge we have today, and it's from one of my favorite cartoonists, Claude Niklas, and it is actually in Sweden. I have translated it to English. So, but that's basically what you want. You actually want everything to be all right, and when you feel that position being threatened, that's when everything turns upside down. And if we look at how we form an opinion about the world today, this is me or you in the middle, and getting a sense for how the society works from a closer community and work and school. It's with physical contacts. It could be digital as well, but it's with real people that you actually know, and that they are more or less your friends. But if you want to understand Sweden or the world to a broader sense, it is still the traditional news media that you get the information from, where you're actually trying to understand how the society works or how the world works. It's still the traditional media. But they might not be transferred via the traditional media. And this might be a big difference from US and Sweden, but looking from Sweden's perspective, it's still mainly the traditional media that comes to you, but they can come to you through social media as well. But then you have to just understand it's a difference between transportation and content, and you have to see the media providers as content provider, not transmissions, because the transmission has changed a lot in a very short time because of digitalization. But unfortunately, also the content production has changed a lot. And if we look at how you trust the media, 67% of the Swedes, last time I looked, it was almost a year now, 67% have a large or quite large trust in TV, but only 13% in kvällstidningar or tabloids. But 88% followed news daily. So we are following the news. So maybe it was 100% 15 years ago, but I don't think so. So we still follow the news. And I'm quoting myself, because I realized that was a new thing for me as well. But it's important to think about this, because the goal of news reporting must be that you're a little bit wiser afterwards than before. And if you think of the news reporting that you see, how often is this true? Often you're even more confused and probably a little bit angry, because there's another problem that you didn't know and that you can't solve. And this new media logic is that speed is the actual goal. And when speed is the goal, the reporting gets shallow. And everyone is saying the same thing, because you're competing again. If there is one newsworthy item right now, everybody has to say the same thing more or less. You can't be last, at least. But that also could very easily look like a conspiracy, because if everybody is saying the exact same thing at the exact same time, the diversity in media has suddenly disappeared. And you also easily get surrounded by disaster. And there's also, if it bleeds, it leads. That's the old media logic. And if everybody's looking at the same bleeding news story at the same time, it looks much worse than it might be. And you're also left with more questions than answers, because you seldom get an explanation. You only get somebody, oh, this is happening right now, breaking news. But it also creates a vacuum for answers, because a new question that needs to be answered opens up for someone else to actually answering that question. Actually someone saying, we know what's going on. We have the truth. This is what's actually happening. And that is also often filled by fake news. And if you look, at least in Sweden, if you look at how they frame the news, they also say, we have the truth, we know what's actually going on. And they also work very much with traditional news, the visual media aids of news, trying to get us look as trustworthy as possible. But I think Scott will tell us a lot more about that. But also, if getting a lower credibility makes the lies look just as credible as the truth. And I've invented a little lost trust circle. Because looking at the media logic now, the emotions are more or less more valuable than knowledge in the public space. Because emotions is always true. If I'm angry, that is true. But facts might be debated. But you're also creating a false balance, because that's more interesting, because then you get an entertaining debate. And the most entertaining debates are facts versus emotions, because then you really get an entertaining debate. But also, this is the traditional news logic that's been used forever, basically, that you replace new facts by new alternative facts. But you're not calling it new alternative facts, you're calling it breaking news. Apple might kill you. But it's still new alternative facts. So when Kellyanne Conway used that phrase, it turned everybody upside down. But at the same time, this has been the media logic and is the media logic in a general sense, always. But when new facts replace alternative facts, like, oh, I ate an apple and I might die, this creates an uncertainty, because suddenly everything you've been basing your world on might be turned upside down because of the new breaking news. And this makes your circle of trust shrink, because the people you trust, because suddenly this wasn't safe anymore, but this is still. So the people you trust are getting smaller because of uncertainty. And you start to worry and you start to clam up. And this is actually what people call the post-truth, in my view at least, because it's not the thing that you don't trust the facts anymore, it's that you don't trust the people giving you the facts anymore, because they aren't valuing facts in the way that they did before. So because looking at the real flat earther and people like that, they really use facts. It's just a very selective bag of facts they use, but they are very fact driven, but they're wrong, but they don't trust people not giving you the facts that they believe in. So it's not that we don't trust facts anymore, it's that we don't trust the sender of or the ones giving us the facts, because they're not valuing the facts that much as we thought they would. A little bit of just trying to explain some words. I've been doing this for several years, but they're more or less it's still true. When we talk about the immigration, what we are actually meaning is that we've heard that we're close to a structural collapse. We heard that the employment is a problem, that money is gone everywhere, and then what we need is money. So why can we afford taking care of another problem that's not our immediate problem? That's one of the big trend that I see, but there's blame the immigration, basically. But also that we don't have the perspective. Looking at Sweden, it was a couple of years ago when I looked at it, but 97% of Swedish household had got a radical increase in income. And it was 97%, I think. But at the same time, you don't see that. You only see, because you think it's the opposite, that everyone but me has gotten it worse, because you only see the bad example. You don't see the perspective. and you don't know that if you're better, have been better off the last like 10 years, you think you're lucky because you don't understand why you've been better off when all you see is everyone who's been worse off. So if you don't know how the actual society looks, then luck is the only reason why you're not the one being worse off. And looking at how you present the leader, it's never in a good way, unless you are in Russia, I think, because in general it's like the leader has done something wrong, basically. But this is the reason why we have a large voter mobility, and we really have a large voter mobility right now, because we don't know the society we live in today. We see the leader, this is here now, but has not been, it's only the bad things we see. And then we don't have money for anything anymore. So it's because of the insecurity, and you have to blame the sitting regime. So if we go from this, then we have 59% who actually think that the future will be worse than today. And you also know that you as an individual have done nothing wrong. It must be someone else who's done it, because you're a good citizen. And you also know it was better before, but it's always been better before. And that's like a human nature, because I don't think we as a population would have survived if we only remember the bad things. But we remember that the good things, and then we are aware of the bad things that might be around the corner. But we are victims, because and someone else must be the cause of this negative development. And the first step is to actually find the one saying this. So you don't have to start with the people, the one who has the solution. But then it is more complicated when we get to that step, of course. But I think I'll stop there. No, sorry, I'll stop with this. This also Claude Niklas, but I love this picture. I asked him to draw it for me. Because I think that the main reason here is when the media shifted because of the digitalization, and that they couldn't handle their business model, it turned so much upside down. And what we see now are side effects of this, but it's also making us a lot more vulnerable.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out for this conversation and discussion on changes in the information environment, the political landscape, and in particular, what I'll talk about is disinformation and propaganda, and particularly a couple of techniques that my research has observed affecting Sweden. As Torbjörn said, I come from Arizona State University, and I should say that I'm here this week at the invitation of the U.S. Embassy. So I thank my U.S. Embassy colleagues, and I thank Novus for hosting this event. And the research project that I'll go into some details in here in a couple of minutes is also sponsored by the U.S. Department of State. So I'm very thankful for the support that our government has provided for our research. I work in an organization called the Global Security Initiative, which is a department of Arizona State University that is charged with advancing interdisciplinary research into complex challenges facing national security. And I lead our efforts in the area of narrative, disinformation, and strategic influence. It's one of our newest areas, and so this is one of our first research projects specifically under the Department of the Global and Security Initiative. So what I thought I'd do is walk through some context that will be very similar in a way to what Torbjörn just presented, from a security studies perspective, perhaps, rather than a political media environment perspective. And then we'll put that together with the study of disinformation and propaganda. And I think those two things will fuse together, and I think we'll have a lively discussion afterwards. So let's see how that
the white button.
The white button. Yeah. Excellent. All right. Very good. So to start, since I'll use a handful of terms, particularly propaganda and disinformation, just thought I'd share some definitions so that we're all So you understand where I'm coming from. I define, for the purposes of my research, propaganda as highly biased, often misleading, information distributed to advance an agenda, usually on behalf of a nation state or an organization. So that's a fairly broad definition of a particular category of information. Disinformation, which is a term very popular in the news today. I expect it's very popular in the news in Sweden. It is certainly very popular in the news in the United States. False, inaccurate, or misleading information spread with the willful intent to deceive. Whereas false is part of the definition, it is not an exclusive component of disinformation. Disinformation might start as a piece of true information, but the manner in which it is distributed may introduce some inaccuracies or something misleading. And a key component about disinformation is that willful intent to deceive, which actually makes identifying disinformation, there's an additional challenge because you have to figure out what the intent of the sender is. Misinformation, on the other hand, is false, inaccurate, or misleading information that is distributed for a non-deceitful purpose. It might be a piece of information that starts as disinformation because the original sender has an intent to deceive, and they have subsequently deceived an audience member who then unknowingly continues to spread that information. But that person doesn't have a deceptive intent, so we wouldn't call their furthering that information deceptive and therefore disinformation. Another example of misinformation might be satire. The satirist expects his or her audience to already understand the framework of the satire, the cultural clues that indicate the piece of information is satire. But taken out of that context, a new audience member might not perceive that information as satire, and then they are misled to believe something that is inaccurate. But again, the original purpose of the distribution was not deceitful. We won't be talking so much about malinformation tonight, but it is another category of this kind of information that has a potentially malicious or nefarious component, and in particular, malinformation is spread with the specific intent to harm. So hate speech is a good example of malinformation. So what does propaganda and disinformation do? And this becomes sort of central to how we set up our research project. We see propaganda and disinformation as participating in dismissing, distorting, distracting, or introducing dismay to the audience. And I think you'll see a connection here in particular to what Torbjörn was just talking about, the emotional component, the reduction of critical thinking, and the replacement of the distribution of knowledge and information with the distribution of the activation of strident emotions. And we see that in particular in the disinformation activities. And in fact, this particular image is derived from one of the sponsored posts that the Internet Research Agency placed on Facebook for U.S. audiences in 2016 prior to the election. And what you'll see is that the organization is called Secured Borders, and the sign, this is a traditional traffic sign shape in the United States, and this says, "No invaders allowed." It's a caution sign. And this was designed to appeal to the segment of the political spectrum that is very much in favor of restrictive immigration policies and very intensive border control measures, to include a wall. This is actually a piece of fencing that is on the southern border of the United States. But interestingly, that this particular post, through the specific efforts of the Internet Research Agency, was placed in such a way as that it would show up not only in the news feeds of members that were of a demographic profile that would suggest that they were supporters of strong border security, but also placed in the opposite demographic groups, people that would normally be opposed to such. And the purpose in both cases was to generate a strong emotional reaction. In the case of the supporters of border security, it's that positive affirmation that border security is necessary because there are these invaders on the other side of the border. I grew up in Southern California. There is not an invading army coming from the south. It also dismays the opposite side of the political spectrum because it instills a shock and a challenge to their political viewpoint. Okay, so what is going on in the information environment that is enabling disinformation to proliferate in ways that we haven't seen before? I would argue that propaganda and disinformation have been part of political discourse. They've been part of international affairs for as long as humans have been communicating, which pretty much is the length of human history. But there's something different going on now. I think we can all say that there is something different. There's something feels inherently different. So how do we try and characterize that a little bit? One, there's the forces of globalization. And I really love, I'm going to steal your handbrake or emergency brake image and metaphor, because I think that's what they're putting the brakes on is globalization. And globalization has a couple of things that are going on in it. And particularly these networks of flows that have changed. There's flows of commerce. So we've got the ease of distribution of goods on a global scale that is unprecedented. There's the flows of finances. So there is a internetworking of finances on an international scale that is also new. And there is the flows of people. And we see that cropping up in a whole variety of different ways. Like this, or stimulating thoughts about that. But then there's also the flows of information. And the changes in the information environment are widespread, and there's a whole variety of different changes. One is the speed and scale and distance of the transfer of information. And another is the disruption to the traditional relationship of information producer and distributor and information consumer. In the early part of the 21st century, there was a lot of utopic, idealistic rhetoric about the democratization of the spread of knowledge and the rise of the citizen journalist. And I still believe that there is some great value in the ability of, and a good example of this is when in the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami, a lot of the imagery that was spread very quickly around the globe about the serious nature of the Boxing Day tsunami was by individuals that were taking photos with their mobile phones and then posting them to blog sites, which then subsequently got picked up by the mainstream media because the mainstream media did not have reporters on the ground in the locations where the tsunami was hitting or had hit. So that's great. Being able to get more information out theoretically, more access to greater information means that more people have more information available to them. They're better educated, etc. There are some darker sides to this, but the barriers to entry now no longer require the massive capital infrastructure of a newspaper or of a radio network or of a television station. To become a major influencer on the within the media landscape. In a couple of earlier audiences, how many people in this audience are familiar with Pewdiepie? Okay, think of Pewdiepie has a global reach, has a massive following, and this started because he liked to play video games and talk about them. I don't necessarily personally understand the appeal. I'm also not a video gamer. I'm also not part of the demographic that likes to listen to snarky comments about video games. But the point of Pewdiepie, the relevance of Pewdiepie for this discussion is that he required almost no infrastructure. And the changes in the information environment and the ability to garner audiences through nothing more than being present and gaining popularity. There's very little, there's a substantial disruption. He represents a significant threat to established business models in the field of entertainment and journalism. So then we have another individual that I think most people here will recognize that is representative of the changes in information environment. So his ability to collect, store, and distribute information is representative of a significant change in the nature of power, where there is a devolution of the nature of power to the individual. He can, because of the information that he has access to, because of the information that he has the ability to distribute, which 25 years ago would have required at least a substantial logistical effort to store that information. Even if it was stored electronically, it would have had to have been stored in some sort of physical media. Even if it was floppy disks, it would have been a suitcase full of floppy disks or a giant steamer trunk full of floppy disks. And to get it from his provider to his own location would have required some degree of logistical challenge. And now it's 3 clicks of a button to transmit terabytes of data across the globe. And now he can parse that out with whatever partners he chooses that have access to the Ecuadorian embassy. Well, I guess he's out now, so. But the point being that the individual as an information actor has increased significantly the individual's power. That has also, all of these changes also mean that the individual has become an information target for influence in ways that might be different than 50 years ago. Particularly with the ability for micro-targeting, rather than a broadcast approach to trying to influence an audience. Now there's the ability to target smaller segments of a particular community, and that feeds that ability of disinformation to dismay, because you can position 2 groups against each other, and to distort and distract and dismiss. So why does this matter in the field of security studies? This is the big, Torbjörn mentioned the poll of how many parliamentarians are concerned that that democracy is at risk, and only 40% said a pretty large. We should invite them to the discussion, because I would argue that the security of our democratic processes, which are dependent on our citizens' abilities to gather information and then make informed decisions and then express their political will through civic participation, voting being one, calling one's member of parliament or congressman or whoever their political representative is to express their will, it depends on access to information. And therefore, if an external actor takes advantage of these changes in the information environment in order to disrupt the citizens' access to information, that affects the security of the democratic process and therefore ultimately the sovereignty of democratic nations. So thus, it's the argument that this is more than simply a communication studies problem, it becomes a security studies problem. Oops, sorry. Okay, so I want to shift here to talk a little bit about the research that we have been conducting at Arizona State. This is the project that's sponsored by the US State Department. And we're looking at the ideological techniques and operational procedures of disinformation and propaganda. Tonight, I just want to focus on these 2 elements up here in the ideological techniques. Because that gets a little bit to what Torbjörn was also talking about how do people conceptualize their place in the world, and then ultimately ties back to their decision making. And I also want to focus there because it also keeps the focus on traditional media. The operational procedures dimension of our project talks a little bit more about social media. We can talk about that a little bit in the Q&A if we'd like. So, 2 ideological techniques, framing and narrative. And I'll describe what I mean by those 2 things as I walk through the research project. So the first part of our approach to studying framing, and framing we define as the use of words, images, and phrases to guide the interpretation of a set of facts. So if I were to say, the Swedish government published crime statistics yesterday, and crime has risen by 20% over the past 5 years. That would be a fact. If I were to say that the Swedish government published crime statistics yesterday, which show that crime has risen 20% over the last 5 years, which is evidence of the complete failure of the Swedish law enforcement agencies to protect the citizens. I would be framing that fact as evidence of governmental incompetence. So we have a collection of 23,000 news articles, of which a subset of them were sourced from Russian state-owned and pro-Russia leaning news outlets. And the reason that we chose that was we wanted to frame our study with the principle of framing, of adversarial framing, and using adversarial in the sort of legal context, whereby there are two opposing sides that present their arguments for some sort of objective judge or evaluator. And in this, applying that metaphor to this communication environment, we have the Russia as one adversary, and then the audience being the sort of semi-objective evaluator. And so what we do, we've collected these texts, then we read them with a team of analysts, not specialist analysts. These are actually undergraduate research assistants that work with me at ASU. And we code for examples of framing, and I'll go through what the framing categories that we have identified within our data set that are applicable to the Swedish information environment. And then we train a machine classifier to read at scale, because it's really hard for a human or even a team of humans to read 23,000 news articles. And we would like to use this methodology on a variety of information environments and in a variety of data sets. And in fact, the larger the data set, the better off we are. And then that will allow us to detect shifts over time. And I'll show you one graph that's an example of how that turns out. So here's, I mentioned 23,000 news articles from 2010 to 2018. And I would describe this as a global data set because we got our data from a third-party data provider. And what they provided us was data, news articles from outlets that circulate in Sweden or are talking about Sweden. So there is, and that applies to both the whole data set and the subset that I previously mentioned that were these Russia state-owned and pro-Russia, acknowledged by subject matter experts as pro-Russia biased news outlets. And so in both cases, this is sort of, we're looking at the global information environment relevant to Sweden as opposed to specific Swedish audiences. That would be a follow-on study that we'd really like to do. We'd have to get a slightly different data set for that. Okay, here are the framing categories that we identified by humans reading these news articles and keeping track of how topics were, how facts and events were being, our interpretation of events was being guided. So the most prominent frame, the top three are the most prominent frames that we discovered. The bottom three are also present. And so these titles are what the research team came up with, the titles to provide a category. And that example about the crime statistics and whether it was evidence of government incompetence would fall into this second category, criticism of the government, where the government is functioning improperly or ineffectively, or that it has corruption, or it acts in ways that are not in the benefit of Swedish citizens. And most of the government, anti-government framing that we've seen in the Swedish data set is focused largely on the police law enforcement agencies, which is a contrast to previous studies we've done on other countries, Ukraine and Latvia in particular, where there was a lot of discussion of corruption of both municipal and provincial and national governments, where we just don't see much in the way of corruption in the Swedish data set. The anti-immigrant frame blames societal ills in Sweden on the large influx of immigrants and refugees. Very closely related to the crime rampant, which is a frame that a key part of this is this idea that these sentences, sentences that included this framing are intentionally sowing fear in the Swedish society suggesting crime is everywhere, or these sentences overtly articulate that there is widespread fear of crime. Either the crime act, that's the fact being framed, it's being framed as evidence of how fearful Swedish society is about the rising crime. Anti-EU, anti-NATO frames actions as threats either to the safety of Russia or to the stability of Europe, and detrimental to the economy of Sweden and to the sovereignty and traditional neutrality of Sweden. And generally speaking, even though EU and NATO are two completely different organizations with completely different goals and missions and origins, etc., within this data set, they were the way they appeared in these sentences that were evident of framing of an external actor meddling, either as a threat to the safety of Russia or the detrimental to the economy and sovereignty and neutrality of Sweden. Those frames applied equally to EU and NATO, and so that's why we combined them into a single category. Then there's frames that a variety of different activities are evidence of Russia being a positive ally for Sweden, and then a interpretation of events as indicative of the rise of fascism in Sweden. So the fascism and the criticism of the government, these two frames were also evident in much greater intensity in our two previous studies of Latvia and Ukraine. The other frames in those studies were completely different. And in the Q&A, I can talk a little bit about the evolution of the project. So, what does it look like when we have a machine classifier go through all of the articles and then plot frame densities, which is the percentage of framing, the percentage of sentences exhibiting framing over all sentences for that day. So this is a daily graph. So it's really, really noisy. But I have annotated a couple of things to highlight here. So this one's a government spike in government framing. This is a combined spike. This is both a anti-immigrant and anti-EU, anti-NATO. There's anti-immigrant and a crime rampant frame. Now, what do we think we can do with this? We need to smooth out the graph a little bit because it's almost unreadable as noisy as it is. But then we can correlate with events on the ground, and that's what we've done in previous studies with Ukraine and Latvia. And there's a variety of things that we might expect. I gave this presentation to a group earlier today, and they hypothesized that they would expect to see a lot of spikes right before Swedish elections. And that doesn't jump off the page here looking at this graph. But there might be a whole variety of other potential events that might be happening in the political landscape. There might be important votes in Parliament about how Sweden is going to approach its relationship with the EU, how Sweden is going to approach its relationship with Russia, how Sweden is going to approach its relationship with NATO. You'll also notice a fairly stark difference between the quality of the signal here in the 2010 to 2015 and then following 2015. We haven't figured that out yet. Our first thought was there was something wrong with our data or something different in the nature of our data from the first 5 years of our collection to the last 3. And we looked at our data and there is no evident difference, at least in terms of distribution of quantity of articles, and it's all the same sources. And I should say these are the signals from that subset that is from the Russia state-owned media sources. So we've got a couple of hypotheses, one of which is that right around this time is when the refugee crisis takes off, which might be a provocation or an opportunity for a propaganda disinformation actor to jump into the information environment because there's already a lot of destabilization in the debates within political discourse. That's a potential explanation that this was in fact a strategic change. But that at this stage would be a hypothesis, and we're looking into what that might be. So I'll move on to the next side of the ideological techniques, and that's narrative, and I'll walk through 3 narrative systems, and then we'll open up for discussion. It's important to understand how we approach narrative in our research project. Rather than narrative being a tweet, or a narrative being a slogan, or a narrative being a single news article, or generally what something means. That's close, but in order to unlock the power of narrative analysis as a methodology, it's important to understand, in my view, and this is my background, my academic background is narrative theory and media studies, to understand narrative as a system of stories with a particular structure and with components that are resolving a conflict through this logic of cause, effect, and consequence. So that kind of looks like this, to put it in a little drawing, whereby I'm not going to make the claim that every single narrative system on the planet in human history has this particular structure, but this is a very common structure for narratives to have. There are parties in conflict that creates a desire, and then there are a series of actions and events that either advance towards the satisfaction of that desire or complicate the approach towards that desire. And then that satisfaction, whether it's resolved positively or resolved negatively, in a narrative system that is looking back at past events and explaining how you got there, that's an explanatory resolution. Very often in the field of propaganda and disinformation and strategic communication more broadly, there is an aspirational resolution. So there is something proposed about how this story system ought to resolve. So let's look at a couple of these, how these play out in our data set. It's the same data set that I just described for the framing side of the project. And in this particular, so we've got 3 of these narrative systems. And again, it's a system of stories. There's a whole bunch of news stories that my team read and thought about and asked themselves some key questions in terms of categorizing this. Who are the characters, who are the actors at the core of these stories? And how can we put them into a group? And so in the case of this narrative system, the protagonist is Swedish society, and the antagonists are those forces that are eroding society, because the core conflict is that Swedish culture is under threat from a wide variety of actors. And that creates, within this story system, a goal to maintain Swedish society and maintain Swedish culture, which then gets articulated a little bit more narrowly in terms of stopping the influences that are doing the erosion. And those influences tend to, a set of those influences, Western ideas such as that coming from the EU and the United States. And another force for change are immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees. And so here are some examples of the types of stories, and there's a large number of stories that get collected into this narrative system and that operate different functions within the narrative system. So, for example, the story that is linked from the image there is about an acquittal from domestic abuse charges attributed to Sharia law. So the story is suggesting that this introduction of Sharia law into Swedish jurisprudence is eroding Swedish culture. Now we can have a debate about the degree to which that is a false claim, an inaccurate claim, or a misleading claim, which would put that into the category of disinformation. But more importantly, from my perspective, is what is it doing to how we understand the world around us? And I would say that it is participating, its broader goal is to participate in this narrative system to suggest, in fact, that Swedish culture is under threat. Just like anti-hate speech policies that would restrict the wide range of freedom of speech, because certain speech is now going to be restricted, is thus also a complication to maintaining Swedish culture and Swedish society, because one of the tenets of Swedish culture is freedom of speech, and this restricts that, and so therefore it is a complication. Other stories that fit into this system is the degree to which the US and EU are meddling with Sweden, particularly with being a puppet master affecting traditional Swedish neutrality, and that suggests that that is a loss of sovereignty. So what is the resolution? The resolution that is implied by this story system is that retreating from global engagement would protect Sweden. If Sweden was not accepting refugees, there would not be these outside influences that are eroding Swedish culture. If Sweden was not closely tied to other members of the EU, then EU liberalism would not be eroding Swedish culture. So that's one of the three narrative systems that I want to talk about tonight. The next is this idea of violence overrunning Sweden, where, again, protagonist is Swedish society, the antagonist is the criminal element, and what is the desire or goal? A safe and secure Sweden. What kinds of stories participate in this system? Stories about the ineffectiveness or the incompetence of Swedish law enforcement, misrepresentation of crime statistics, which is used as evidence that Sweden is unsafe or violent. In both cases, these are complications to achieving a safe, secure Sweden. And this evidence that Sweden is unsafe and violent articulates also the core conflict in this narrative system. Now, this is interesting about this particular narrative system. We've got a bunch of stories about individual citizens executing heroic acts, intervening in a crime act ongoing and stopping it, intervening in what would otherwise be the role of public safety, so helping stop a fire. So these end up celebrating the heroism of individuals, but these individuals are doing actions that would normally be law enforcement or public safety or some other responsibility of a government agency. So the implication there is that the government isn't doing its job, and it ought not. We ought to place our faith in the heroism of individuals. And I will leave that for your consideration, whether that is a typically Swedish attitude or if that is something new and different. And the implied resolution is that that the government that currently controls law enforcement agencies is clearly not working for Swedes, and therefore it should be replaced. Lastly, the most open-ended of the narrative systems that we identified within our data set is this idea of the Sweden and Russia relationship. Again, the protagonist is Sweden, and this time it's more like the Sweden as a nation state rather than Sweden as a society. The core conflict is a question, really, about whether Sweden and Russia are collaborators or competitors. And so that creates this uncertainty. And the desired goal is a stable relationship with Russia. And this is a narrative system that kind of has two trajectories, kind of a positive trajectory that resolves in a stable relationship with Russia, and a negative trajectory which is implied with a unstable relationship with Russia with additional negative consequences for Sweden. And so along the negative trajectory is Swedish participation in NATO activities. There's a lot of articles that talk about the role, the closer that Sweden gets with NATO, the more threatening that is to Russia, the more threatening that is to regional stability, and the more threatening that is to Sweden. However, there's also a bunch of stories about cooperation, such as cooperating on the Arctic Treaty. That would suggest a collaborative approach. And so the positive resolution is a close economic relationship with Russia and a rejection of NATO. So one of the values, I think, of doing this kind of narrative analysis is that it ends up, one, by asking the question of, well, if this does resolve in the proposed or implied way that the story systems suggest, who benefits? And then who benefits is an opportunity to ascertain what is the intent behind these stories that we already know where they're coming from. They're coming from this set of data from the Russian state-owned media. So that would suggest that as a propaganda and or disinformation activity, we've identified some degree of intent. And the intent is the resolution in this way. And that also tends to line up with, if you read the strategic proclamations from Russian leaders. They would like to see an increase in their sphere of influence and their ability in the region, and a more isolated Sweden would help them out quite a bit. So I very often, when I talk about disinformation and propaganda, I'm asked, like, well, what can we do about it? What can the average person do about it? And so I've got a couple of suggestions as additional takeaways for the night, as well as stimulation for conversation. At the individual level, disinformation, back in the States, most of the research that is in disinformation is all focused on some sort of technological solution so that you can have a browser plugin that will light up your screen bright red when you encounter a piece of disinformation. I don't think that's ever going to happen, but there's a lot of people working on that. I would argue that really fundamentally this is a human problem. So the humans should be reading widely and critically, should be considering the narrative implications of any of these stories, because I firmly believe that we as humans are oriented to make sense of events around us in a narrative framework. And so if you understand the narrative implications of any particular story, how it might participate in one of these narrative systems, you can figure out who benefits, and therefore what agenda might be being promoted, and whether this falls into some form of propaganda or disinformation. Pay attention to the origins and the sources, distinguishing between opinion and news journalism. That gets back to a little bit about the media environment, cross-checking for corroboration. And then also at the organizational level, this translates from a human problem to a whole of society problem. And proactive communication plans, because disinformation actors love an information vacuum. And then this idea of telling stories that collect into a coherent narrative system can help audiences make sense of the values, beliefs, and goals that a particular organization is advocating for.